It's been almost a year now since I posted my original story breakdown of Signalis, and to say that it has performed beyond my expectations would be quite the understatement. I had no idea that it would resonate with so many players, and want to thank you all for the many views, likes, and shares. They are hugely appreciated. I remain very proud of that video and stand behind my double dream theory presented within. But at the same time, I've come to see that my former analysis is flawed in many ways, with some bad translations, bad pronunciations, and a whole slew of unforced errors that I've documented here. Feel free to pause the video if you want to read through them. Perhaps more importantly though, it is now a little outdated, as 2 patches were added to the game post-launch that contribute substantially to its world, story, and characters. So, taking all these factors into account, I figured it was the right time to make a return to Signalis. This video is going to be several things. First, a retrospective look at the first one, in which I'll be making corrections to some details and theories while reaffirming others, a discussion of both patches regarding what they add to and change about the lore, and finally, a brief overview of the entire game reflecting my revised, more unified take on the story. Before getting into that, though, I want to quickly reiterate the purpose of these videos. I'm calling them story breakdowns and not explanations because, while I am offering up my own interpretation of the game, my intent is not to explain it so much as show you all its pieces and let you decide for yourself what they mean. At the end of the day, I believe you simply must play the game yourself to get the full experience, because Signalis is well beyond any one person's ability to explain. So much of it is emotionally driven, and while others can tell you what happens, no one can tell you what to feel. And on that note, let's give this another go, shall we? The single biggest mistake I made in my original breakdown was mistranslating the title of Chapter 1 as Synchronization when in actuality it is Synchronicity. This happened because I was using Google's camera translate feature at the time, which, as it turns out, is not very good. I did eventually catch on to its finicky nature and started verifying each translation for the video by running them through multiple tools, but somehow missed this one critical word. And apparently I wasn't the only one, as Yuri Stern noticed and took issue with this trend on social media, subsequently choosing to patch in a document that makes the correct meaning much more obvious to new players. While I still think my former explanation of Chapter 1 holds up surprisingly well, with observations that make sense in context of the game's themes and structure, it is certainly incomplete, and so now I want to set the record straight and talk about synchronicity. The concept was first introduced around the year 1930 by the analytical psychologist Carl Jung, who used it to describe circumstances that appear meaningfully related yet lack a causal connection. It is, effectively, the theory of meaningful coincidence experienced when completely independent events with no apparent connection nevertheless form an unmistakable pattern. And for Jung, it all started with trigrams. At some point in his career, he began to study the I Ching, one of the 5 classic texts of Confucianism that is primarily concerned with the concept of change. The document is composed of 64 hexagrams, each built from 2 trigrams, and was used for divination. The seeker would toss coins or pull yarrow stalks to select a random passage from the text, which was then believed to give insight into their inner state of mind and being. Jung personally found this practice enlightening and even recommended it to some of his patients. But there was a problem. How could he reconcile this phenomenon with established science? The solution, as explained by Jung himself, was this. The science of the I Ching is based not on the causality principle, but on one which, hitherto unnamed because not familiar to us, I have tentatively called the synchronistic principle. The concept of synchronicity continues to be an important part of analytical psychology today, and there are many common examples. Let's say you have a dream one night about a person you haven't spoken to in a long time, and the next day they suddenly give you a call. Or maybe you can't help but notice the same number appearing everywhere you go. Or perhaps you run into someone who is the spitting image of a friend or family member despite having no relation to them whatsoever. There's no way these events are connected, and yet you can't help but feel that they are, and that is enough. The point of synchronicity is that there is meaning to these seemingly random occurrences, but it is subjective meaning unique to each individual. This type of association forms the very bedrock of Signalis and is key to understanding not only Chapter 1, but the whole story, and should guide our approach to analyzing it. Let's start with the new document I mentioned earlier. In the E2's bookstore on Rotfront, a book lying open on the counter titled Resonant Phenomena can now be interacted with. After getting a clear definition of synchronicity, we read the following observation. Before the advent of bioresonance technology, acausal correlations were often falsely interpreted simply as chance. Many phenomena such as remote viewing, doppelgangers, or the Pauli effect have since been classified as synchronistic phenomena related to bioresonant effects. This is huge. Here we are told, in no uncertain terms, that bioresonance is the cause of synchronicity. It is the invisible string that ties people and places together across time and space in ways that are not fully understood. Since everything we see in Signalis is being warped by Ariane and Falca's bioresonant signals, it is little wonder that synchronicity is ubiquitous. Just as Ariane has a doppelganger in Alina, Adler and Nikolai are strikingly similar, and the aforementioned Pauli effect, which is basically the idea that technical equipment will fail in the presence of certain individuals, might make an appearance in Chapter 1 when the elevator Elster is riding suddenly loses power on level B3. Remote viewing plays an especially important role in the story, but that's a topic I'll come back to later. This new revelation on bioresonance is very interesting, but it does produce something of a paradox. If synchronistic events are, by definition, acausal, but bioresonance is now known to be the definite cause, can we really call it synchronicity anymore? Hard to say, but I think the term does still apply in the sense that the meaning of these connections remains subjective, and this directly ties into the overall experience of trying to understand Signalis. As you play through the game, you'll start making these connections, noticing patterns, tying things together, until it becomes a sort of ritual, and just when you think you've crossed the threshold to understanding, it all falls apart. There is no way around this, because to perfectly comprehend would require that you know every possible meaning to every single person, and such an endeavor can only end in madness. But the truth is, you really don't need to. At its core, Signalis is pretty simple. It is the story of two individuals, a replica who is degrading, falling apart mentally, chasing a memory that does not belong to her, trapped in a cycle of annihilation, all while desperately clinging to her fragile humanity. And a human who is suffering, falling apart physically, calling out from the void to the one she loves to end it once and for all. And these two are tied together by a promise. Everything beyond this is subjective synchronicity that you can choose to engage with or not. But the sheer depth of these connections, the artistic, religious, and philosophical lenses used to frame each event in the story are what makes Signalis so striking and memorable. As I mentioned in the intro, Rose Engine developed 2 patches for Signalis in the year following its release in an effort to correct inconsistencies and further build out the world, with many small but significant adjustments being made to the game's presentation and lore. In this section, I'll be focusing on the most important and interesting of these changes. There is a plethora of smaller ones to be sure, like adjusted item positions, new posters, and slight rephrasing of some documents, but the impact of these is fairly minimal and not really worth covering here. Also, while I did my best to organize these changes by the patch they were applied in, for some of them I'm honestly just not sure, and since the official patch notes don't call out any of this stuff specifically, I had to make some educated guesses as to whether some things were added in patch 1.1 or 1.2. The first of these, titled Sparrow, released on February 20th of 2023 and brought small but meaningful changes to most areas of the game. Most notably, the close-up shot of Ariane sleeping on Elster's shoulder after the Penrose dancing scene was changed, with Ariane's hair now appearing short instead of long. I theorized previously that this discrepancy might hint at a passage of time between these shots, but turns out it was just a continuity error, which honestly makes more sense. While on the topic of hair, Nikolai's image in the Rotfront medical database was adjusted so that his hair now looks more unique and a little less like Adler. I already had serious doubts that Nikolai could have been Adler's original Gestalt, and this change seems to have been made to help dispel that notion further, even if they do still look very similar. There are a few other changes in Rotfront. The email regarding access to the E2's bookstore is now signed Anya E2, which supports my assertion that Lilith was not the twins' mother. The photo store email was changed as well, being signed Camilla Young instead of just Young, removing any ambiguity as to who this individual might be. Moving over to Sierpinski now, we find that the search protocol document from level B2 now has photos showing each of the suspects. A chilling detail, considering that for some of them, this was likely the last photo they ever had taken. In the shooting range, we find an accuracy log tacked onto one of the central pillars, showing the gradual decline of the facility's replicas as the corruption took hold. The Yule dorm was brightened up a bit by the addition of string lights hung on many of the bunks, a detail that adds to the environmental storytelling of this room by making it feel a little more homey. The Penrose vessel received a few additions as well. If you turn on the radio during the Penrose memory sequence, 2 Morse code transmissions can be decoded. The first at 90 Hz, which reads Emergency Broadcast Penrose 512, and the second at 138 Hz, which reads Wake Up. These details cast a dark shadow over the sequence, reminding Elster that this is but a memory of happy times now long gone. After she realizes this and crawls back up to the Penrose on Rotfront, we find another small change. The bloody note in the stern hall, in which Ariane writes about her teeth and hair falling out, now turns red after Elster leaves the cryogenics chamber with her new body. It simply reads, "Please, just make it stop. Please." This line is actually being reused from the final note found in this corridor right before the endings, but placed in this context, it feels like a plea to Elster to keep going no matter what, and makes her choice to jump into the flesh pit feel more desperate and personal. The final changes from patch 1.1 that I want to address are a few subtle tweaks to both the loading screens between areas and fatal error screens when Elster is killed. The previous loading screen had a line reading Memtest 512R, which now reads DZS check 256R, and this is consistent throughout the whole game. The fatal error screen previously specified the replica unit in question as Elster 512 unconditionally, but now it shows Elster S2301 during the Sierpinski section of the game, and in both Nowhere and Rotfront the unit number is corrupted. This is a very important change that I'll be coming back to in just a minute. Patch 1.2, titled Crow, released on October 25th of 2023 and is much more hefty. Best known for revising the inventory system, it also added several new rooms with new lore. The first of these can be found in the Dark Stork dorm on level B7. In the small upper room, a vent hatch can now be found in the floor. Entering and heading to the right reveals a larger space inhabited by an Aura unit who has been growing plants here under a special light. She recognizes Elster and points her to a file sitting on the floor, Operational Procedures Control. This document states the primary advantage of replicas over gestalts to be predictability and explains how operational psychology is used to keep them productive, loyal, and docile for as long as possible. It defines persona degradation simply as the process of a replica deviating from their original gestalt pattern when they are exposed to new situations, and since this makes them less predictable, persona stabilization, the focused manipulation of each individual replica, is practiced to prevent this from happening and mostly takes the form of distracting and calming the unit. It wasn't too difficult to infer that this is how the process worked before, but the clear definition is nice to have. Unsurprisingly, the Aura unit is adamant that she will never return to work after learning the truth, and chooses to stay in the vent indefinitely. Overall, I really like the addition of this room to the game. It means that we now meet at least one sane individual of each replica type, and the encounter reinforces what we are told about Aura units. They are skilled engineers, so she is able to fix Elster's flashlight, and they enjoy taking care of plants, hence the little garden. The other new room added in this patch is a second instance of Adler's study, which is accessed from the long final hallway leading to Falka. If you turn around at the end and walk all the way back to the beginning, a door appears leading back to Adler's study on level B8 of Sierpinski. It appears much the same as it did the first time, but with a key difference. New documents are littered about. Most notably, there are 3 versions of Adler's diary here. This one on the left is the original, and these other two appear to be from alternate timelines. While the first and last entries of all diaries are identical, entries 2 through 6 are different, with the most significant variation concerning Elster. You'll recall that in the original diary, Adler writes of a strange and sudden memory resurfacing in which he spoke with an Elster unit while inspecting the mining site. Except no such replica was ever stationed at the facility, a fact that Calibri confirms after she inspects Adler's mind. Well, these other two diaries reflect past cycles where that did happen. According to these alternate accounts, Adler met with Calibri to review additions to their replica staff and agreed that a single Elster unit would be a good investment. In one cycle, the replica shipment was delayed, and Adler had to do the scheduled inspection of the mining site alone. In another, this unit did arrive in time for the inspection and spoke to Adler about planets and stars while showing him some survey equipment, which made him realize that the dial of his lockbox resembled an astronomical calendar and ultimately led to him figuring out a way to open it. And for what it's worth, Adler describes her chest plate as being orange, not red. There is another new document found in this room as well. Excavation Team C, a short list of replicas including 3 Mina units, 2 Ara units, one of which we met earlier in the vent, and 1 Elster unit, S2301. As I explained in my original breakdown, a core part of the double dream theory is that there are only 2 Elsters. The unit aboard the Penrose with Ariane, and the unit requisitioned by Sierpinski, whom I referred to as Elsters 1 and 2 respectively. This new information all but confirms that to be the case, and not only do we now have a concrete identity for that second unit, but we also know her precise role in the story thanks to that updated fatal error screen from patch 1.1. In all levels of Sierpinski down to the mining site, it displays Elster S2301. We are playing through the game as this second Elster, who is affected by the Magpie signal and as a result is looking for Alina. But in Nowhere and continuing through Rotfront, that unit number becomes corrupted, likely a reflection of Elster's changing mental state as the signal gradually transforms her into Unit 512. Alina vanishes to be replaced by Ariane, the long-forgotten promise starts to materialize, and Elster's grasp of her own identity begins to unravel. She is called by the Sea of Flesh, feeling the pull to become one with the replica haunting the edges of her memory, knowing full well that she can never go back to being herself. Interestingly, this change occurs halfway through Chapter 2, Liminality, which itself refers to a halfway point. This transition of identity is the first threshold Elster must cross, and what leads her to the Red Gate. So those are the most foundational changes in patch 1.2, but the rest of them are still quite significant and affect most areas of the game. For starters, a dictionary was added to the Sierpinski library on level B1 that clarifies the difference between gestalts and replicas. I'll admit that I may have over-explained the meaning of gestalt in my original video, as it seems the main purpose of the term here is simply to indicate someone is an original as opposed to a copy. A few changes were also made in Nowhere, such as this painting now being interactable with a plaque. Elster remarks that it is destroyed beyond recognition, and the plaque reads Metamorphosis. This is a more explicit instance of the transformation theme, building off the repeated appearance of moths and butterflies, and supports my theory that in the artifact ending, Ariane herself undergoes a metamorphosis, emerging from the destruction of her dream in a form unrecognizable. Over in the radio room, we find a small red note titled No Escape sitting on a television set. It reads, "Even in the darkest depths, the songs of the cosmos can still be heard in the ether, the sound of the stars." This ties back to the Song of the Gods book, which frames bioresonance as a mystic, even spiritual phenomenon reminiscent of the Tao. Elsewhere, on the shore of Oblivion, a replica hand can be seen emerging from the wall, probably Elster's. A cool detail that shows Elster has been here before, much like the bodies in the elevator. As was the case for the first patch, the area to get the most changes in 1.2 is Rotfront, and all of them are pretty significant. In the dark apartment, a stolen document can be found on the couch that provides more insight into the process of replica creation. It begins, carefully selected by Aeon, exemplary citizens of the nation are permanently cryogenically preserved in neural archives, each becoming a neural pattern for a new replica model. To preserve the image of the replica as an incorruptible ideal, the original Gestalt is erased from records and public memory. I previously theorized that the original Gestalt died as part of this process, and it turns out that's basically true, with the public erasure taking it to another extreme. Issa and Erica may not have even known Lilith existed, unless of course they had seen Rebecca Leong's contraband photo of her. This document further explains that during the neural pattern transfer process, episodic memories are suppressed so that the resulting replica will retain the skills and personality of their gestalt without possessing specific events from their memory. However, when exposed to certain stimuli, these memories may start to resurface as the replica's persona degrades, which leads to them becoming more individual and thus less predictable. At the other end of Rotfront, 2 new documents were added to the E2 bookstore. Lying open on the floor is the final stanza of Prometheus, a famous poem written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe around the year 1772. It reads, "Here sit I, forming mortals after my image, a race resembling me, to suffer, to weep, to enjoy, to be glad, and thee to scorn as I." On a broad level, the meaning behind this passage is quite obvious. Just like Prometheus, the nation of Yusan formed a race of mortals after their own image, replicas, to fight against or scorn the Empire. But what I find more interesting is the location. Why is this book placed right next to the spot of Issa's demise, if not to suggest it is connected to her in some way? As you may recall, both of my theories regarding Issa suggested that Ariane created her as a self-insert, a way for Ariane to act within her own dream, whether that be trying to find and end herself and prove that she could do things on her own, or to encourage and pace Elster on her journey. I also wondered if perhaps the real Issa was in there somewhere, determined to redeem herself for failing Ariane in the library so long ago. Based on their matching profile shots, you could easily say that Ariane created Issa after her own image, and in this dream world she suffers terribly, scorning the powers that be, all to make the sacrifice in death she had been unable to make in life. The reason she first ends up at Falca's chamber and draws Adler's attention there is because she is trying to trace the source of the signal back to Ariane, not realizing there is a second dreamer emitting a signal of her own, a lesser god. Moving over to the counter now, we find resonant phenomena, some of which I discussed earlier. But after its explanation of synchronicity, the book goes on to say that the basis for the entire field of bioresonance technology is the creation of physical phenomena remotely simply by consciously or unconsciously willing them into existence. As well as supporting my claim that Ariane's signal was an unconscious expression rather than a deliberate choice, this line provides an easy explanation for her manipulation of Sierpinski. Remote viewing. Essentially, this term refers to a person's ability to perceive qualities of a distant location or object merely by sensing them with the mind, even if they have never seen them before. I previously suggested that the Penrose vessel may have been powered by a bioresonant hyperdrive and literally crashed into an alternate dimension, equally accessible from the cold reaches of space and the depths of Lang, but I'm now starting to favor a different explanation. As Ariane lay within her cryopod, dreaming of how her life may have been different had she chosen Sierpinski, she unconsciously used remote viewing to see the facility. A small part of it, at least. To someone who had likely never seen a mine before, it would make sense to picture something more like this than this, and that might be why a bioresonant pocket formed at the mining site rather than in a random office. When Falca went down to investigate this strange phenomenon, she didn't cross into another base dimension. Rather, by stepping through the rift, she passed into the signal itself. This eerie red plane is essentially an SSTV translation of the Magpie signal, a place of emptiness, waiting, promise. It could be that Falca herself is responsible for this translation, acting as a decoder to Ariane's signal as well as a receiver, converting her bioresonant waves into something more tangible. We see that elements of the signal possess physical power here, and though it does share the nuclear repository theme with Nowhere, the two areas feel pretty distinct from each other and are separated by the shaft of the abyss. Interpreted this way, the Penrose is still in space, only crashed in the sense that it is dead in the water, and it is by swimming upstream through the signal that Elster S-2301 is able to actually get there. Considering all these changes to both the game and my interpretation of it, I want to wrap up this video by presenting a very brief summary of Signalis that reflects my current understanding and consolidates every core component of the double dream theory in one place. Following a bleak life of monotony and oppression, Ariane Young chooses to join the Penrose program and sets out on a voyage into deep space. She starts to bond with her Elster replica technician, and in time they fall in love, with Elster 512 experiencing severe persona degradation as Lilith's memories resurface within her. After learning the dark truth about their mission at 3,000 cycles, they try to survive as long as possible and make a promise to each other: I won't leave you behind. But eventually, Elster succumbs to the radiation and dies while Ariane lays in the cryogenic pod, leaving the promise unfulfilled. In pain, Ariane begins to dream, unconsciously projecting Elster's emotions and memories back to her corpse in an attempt to wake her up, which takes the form of the very same signal sent by Mission Control, the Magpie signal. At the same time, she dreams about how her life might have been different if she had taken the Sierpinski work assignment instead, unconsciously using remote viewing to see the mind and alter its physical location with a bioresonant field. This is discovered by Excavation Team C, and when Commander Falca goes to investigate the anomaly, she steps into the signal itself and is hit with the full force of Elster's memories. Their identities now blurred together, Falca returns to her bedroom and begins to dream, suspending the Sierpinski facility in time and altering everyone within it as an extension of Ariane's original signal. And no one is more affected by this than Elster Unit S-2301 of the Excavation Team. Being the same replica model, she is strongly influenced by the memories of this other Elster and knows there is something she needs to do, someone she needs to find, but because the memories are degraded, she thinks she is looking for Lilith's love, Alina. Each time she fails, or dies, Ariane turns over in her sleep, and the world turns over too as the timeline is recycled, creating different versions of reality. Meanwhile, Ariane pulls Issa E2 from her memory, creating the girl after her own image, as it were, to try and find herself within the dream and thus prove that she can take care of herself. The administrator Adler starts to figure out what is going on and, realizing that Elster and Issa are the constant variables, does his best to stop them, with bodies piling up in his wake and the state of the dream growing ever more unstable. Eventually, Elster passes through both dreams and the liminal space between them to confront Falca. Neither one of them has all of Elster 512's memories being broadcast by Ariane, but combined, they do. After killing the commander and becoming one with her, Elster steps directly into the pure signal and follows it back to the Penrose vessel, where she finds the dead body of Elster 512 and returns home to Ariane at last. This cycle continues through countless leave and memory endings until Elster S-2301 fully becomes Elster 512 and keeps her promise, or finds a way to break out of the loop entirely and create an impossible outcome, a final dance with her lover preserved forever. My original take on the endings was that each one was determined by Elster's reconciliation of the Lilith and Elster aspects of her persona, and while I still think that's true, it's incomplete, for we must account for the fact that there are two separate Elsters. I think the leave ending still reflects Lilith, who returns to her home on Veneta, but the memory ending now reflects Elster S-2301, who is a stranger to Ariane and is therefore not recognized. The promise ending reflects Elster 512, returned from the grave to keep her promise, and the artifact ending reflects all three at once. The keys come from Elster S-2301, the gravesite offering comes from Lilith, and the dance comes from Elster 512. An impossible outcome that may transcend not only Ariane, but the very promise itself. You know, I think I finally understand how Adler felt. Playing through Signalis again in preparation for this video, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just slightly out of place, like the game had been taken apart and put back together by someone trying to do it all from memory. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how fitting this is for the game in a meta-narrative sort of way. It's like peering into an alternate version of reality, a new cycle in which events played out just a little bit differently. But no matter how many times I experience this story, no matter how many times I meet Issa or Bio, approach the Penrose under a blood-red sky, or witness the sweet affection of two outcasts who found themselves in the arms of each other, it never loses its edge. Signalis is an impossible journey, an odyssey through death and hell. It is wrenching, devastating. But in the sorrow, in that great sea of despair, there is meaning, love, belonging, sacrifice, and the power of a simple promise. The story of Ariane and Elster is a tragedy, and there is nothing but heartbreak at the end. But just as Siegfried and Odette are at last reunited in death, freed from their mortal coils to embrace in the warm light of eternity, I want to believe that maybe, just maybe, this isn't the end.